So today we will talk about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union. Why we are going to talk about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and European Union? If you talk about, as you know, there is a huge military conflict going on between the Russia and Ukraine, and one of the main reason, if you talk about, is the NATO. So because Ukraine wants the membership of the NATO, and which Russia has objects many times, and that led to the build-up on the European border, and then on the 23rd February, actually Russia launched an attack on Ukraine. So if you talk about, and at the same time, and now which further consolidated the membership of European Union and the NATO, if you talk about. So now there is a more and more cooperation between the European Union and the NATO. Means there is a United States of America and the whole of the European Union, which consists of around 27 members. So this is which further consolidated the cooperation. So remember that. At the same time, if you talk about, the NATO has deployed the more forces and the fighter jets, if you talk about, to counter the Russia if there is any launch or if there is any attack on the NATO member. At the same time, Ukraine has applied the immediate membership of the European Union, which also Russia object. If you talk about, the European Union has also, closed the airspace for Russia. Around the 19 European members has closed the airspace for Russia, and Russia has also taken the retaliatory measure against the 19 European countries. And the United States of America, if you talk about, has also closed the airspace for the Russia. And because of the all of the reason, the NATO and the European Union is currently in news. So let's talk about. So if you talk about the NATO, then remember that you need to understand the brief background, because the NATO has a brief background, and why NATO is very significant, which directly resulted in the Russia and Ukraine conflict, if you talk about. So remember that what happened, the after World War II, Western Europe economically and militarily exhausted. As you know, there is a huge world war, and which led to the civilian deaths, military death, and which actually ruined the economy and military of the Western Europe, or you can say the Europe. After that, what happened actually, the Soviet Union, as you know, Soviet Union emerged powerful and dominated the Central and Western Europe and suppressed all the non-communist political activity. After that, the Soviet Union emerged very powerful, and communist ideology they want to put on every country. And after that, United States of America and Soviet Union, if you talk about, there is an ideological conflict emerged after the Second World War. What happened after that? In 1948, United States of America launched the Marshall Plan, and that Marshall Plan is basically for the economic aid for the Western Europe, for the basically the economic recovery of the Western Europe, and that is the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan is very famous plan, if you talk about. After that, what happened in 1948, Brussels Treaty was signed, and this Brussels Treaty, which is in Belgium, remember that Brussels Treaty is a place which is situated in Belgium, so remember that. And this is basically for the military recovery of Western Europe, and collective defense agreement signed by the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg. Further, if you talk about, in March 1948, actually the communist coup in Czechoslovakia came. And after that, what happened? That discussion took place, and that discussion was joined by the France, Norway. In 4th April 1949 resulted the North Atlantic Treaty. And this is the very important date. Actually, this on the 4th April 1949, North Atlantic Treaty was signed in the Washington DC, and it is also known as the Washington Treaty, if you talk about. So remember that North Atlantic Treaty signed in Washington DC on 4th April, also known as the Washington DC, and that this is how actually origination of North Atlantic Treaty Organization took place. So if you talk about till here, there is no problem in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and there is no formal conflict between the Soviets and the United States of America. But after that, what happened? If that North Korea actually invaded in the South Korea, and which is influenced by the communist Russia. Remember that, if you talk about, in June 1950, and USA decided to counter the Soviet ideology in formal nature. So after that, what happened? That on February 1952, Greece and Turkey also joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So here, this is the good point, and Turkey is also want the security, and this is the collective security under the Article 5, if you talk about, remember that. After that, what happened? On 14th May 1955, Western Germany actually joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that is a very turning point, if you talk about. How it is a turning point? Actually, Western Germany is influenced by the communist Soviet. After that, what happened? Due to the discussion, actually Western Germany decided to join the North Atlantic, and that is lead to the turning point in the history after the Second World War. So after that, what happened? Actually, this resulted and this led to the reaction by the Soviet, and which formed the Warsaw Pact, and this is basically the Warsaw Pact to counter the ideology of the capitalist country, and that led to the formal conflict between the capitalist state as well as the communist state, and it also started the Cold War if you talk about. Now came to North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and what are the basic features of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Remember that, as you know very well, it is basically aimed to counter the Soviet, which is earlier stationed in the Western and Eastern Europe when it was formed on April 4, 1949 if you talk about. Remember that. And what is the main features of the North Atlantic? So it is a continuous expansion toward the eastern side, basically close to the China border, and that's why if you took, now they want to include the Ukraine to counter the Russia. So that actually lead to the conflict between the Ukraine and the Russia if you talk about, and ultimate responsibility lies with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization if you talk about. So how actually this eastward expansion took place? Remember that, as you know, it was formed in 4th April 1949, and after that if you talk about Spain in 1982, Czech Republic, Hungary and the Poland in the 1990. Remember that actually Poland bordered the Ukraine country, so it might be the next target if you talk about. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Remember that Russia, and you know, one of the irked point of the NATO to the Russia if you talk about, this is actually the Baltic countries. Remember that Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania is the Baltic country, and which also borders the Russia. Remember that, and which is now currently at the NATO member. So remember that. If you talk about Romania is also the NATO member, Slovakia and Slovenia, and which actually joined the NATO in 2009. So you seems that you look at that there is a complete eastward expansion toward the Russia border if you talk about. Now Albania and the Croatia in 2009, and Montenegro if you talk about 2017. As you know, 2017, around 4 years earlier if you talk about, and Macedonia in 2020. So remember that 2 years earlier if you talk about. And Ukraine want to be a member, but obviously Russia launched an attack against the Ukraine and want to create a buffer zone. Yes, this is a red line. You cannot cross this red line. So this is said by clearly by Putin, means the Russian president if you talk about. Now if you talk about, remember that NATO is an intergovernmental military alliance. As you know very well, intergovernmental is a keyword from the exam point of view if you talk about. Signed on 4th April 1949, and headquarters is very important from exam point of view, Brussels, Belgium. Remember that if you talk about. And heart of the NATO is Article 5. As you know very well, what is the Article 5? Basically, to collective defense against any enemy. If any country is launching an attack against any of the NATO member, they have the collective responsibility to launch against that country. It comes under the Article 5 while using the Article 51 of the United Nations Organization, which gives the either the collective defense or the individual defense. So if you talk about at present the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, then remember that there are the total actually 30 countries which are currently the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and 12 are the founding members of the NATO. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, United Kingdom and the United States of America. And there are the 18 members if you talk about Greece, and as you know Italy, Greece and Turkey actually joined in 1952, and as you know West Germany in 1955, which is a turning point. And after that there are the 15 members towards the east actually joined the NATO. And remember that there are the actually 3 Baltic countries has also joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Ukraine aspire for, and that led to the war between the Ukraine and the Russia. Now let's talk about the European Union. So what happened that after the Second World War, if you talk about, the main job is to unite the Europe. Winston Churchill also advocated basically to unite the Europe and United States of Europe if you talk about. And this is the initiative took place in 1951 if you talk about, when the 6 leaders actually signed the Treaty of Paris. Remember that. And these leaders are the Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands and West Germany. So if you talk about the origin of the European Union, then remember that in 1952 actually founded the European Coal and Steel Community. So remember that if you talk about. And on March 25, 1956, actually 6 members of the European Coal and Steel Communities established the European Atomic Energy Community, and that is also known as the Treaty of Rome. So remember that. So these are the basically two is the very important organization if you talk about, which ultimately lead to the formation of European Union. And remember that, as I've already told you, the process lead to the creation of European Union by the Maastricht Treaty in Netherlands. So remember that, and which came into force on 1st November 1993. So remember that Maastricht Treaty which led to the formation of European Union. And remember that it is basically European Union is an international organization. If you talk about at current, there are the total 27 members, and remember that Ukraine is not a member. Remember that Ukraine is not a member of European Union. If you talk about the member, the Australia, remember that Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, remember that this Cyprus is not a member of NATO. Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland and France. I think Finland is also not a member of NATO. France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta. Malta is also not a member of NATO. Remember that. If you talk about the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania and Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain and the Sweden are the members of the European Union. So further, if you talk about the objectives of the European Union, then remember that there is an increased political cooperation, ensure economic integration, and there will be a single currency popularly known as euro. And remember that this is also applicable in the International Monetary Fund if you talk about. And there is a unified security and the foreign policy, common citizenship right, enhanced cooperation in the areas of judiciary, immigration and the asylum as well. This is very important. If you talk about the decision making body of the European Union, so then remember that there is a European Parliament which is considering the Ukraine membership in European Union currently. If you talk about, there is a European Council, European Commission, Council of European Union, Court of Justice, European Central Bank related to finance if you talk about, and there is a European Court of Auditors related to the auditing and corruption etc. And there is also a Court of Justice if you talk about. So this is all about the European decision making. So this is all about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union. You need to remember the few points related to the NATO as well as the European Union. Remember that NATO is an intergovernmental military alliance and formed in 4th April 1949 if you talk about, and there are the founding members which you need to remember, and there are the 30 members related to the NATO if you talk. What is the main aim? Main aim is basically to counter the Soviet, or currently you can say the Russia. What is the heart of the NATO if you talk about? The Article 5 basically to counter any enemy if you talk about, and if there is a long launch an attack against any of the NATO member, then the whole NATO member or all the NATO member will launch an attack on that country. So this is very important if you talk about the related to the NATO. If you talk about the European Union, then remember that Maastricht Treaty is very important, and 1st November 1993 is very important, which led to the creation of the European Union. And there are the 6 founding members of the European Union, which includes the Belgium, France, Netherlands etc. And there are currently 27 members in the European Union. If you talk about the objectives are very simple, no need to remember. And if you talk about the decision making power in the European Union, then there are the 6 bodies which is in the currently at the European Union decision making. Highest lies with the European Parliament. There is a justice, there is a European Bank. If you talk about European Court of Auditors, European Council and the Commission. So this is all about the NATO and the European Union. Thank you guys. Hope you like this video. You should subscribe my channel. Thank you so much for watching this video.